So in today's video, we are going to be discussing if the Seattle Seahawks are in trouble. Now, before we get into the video, please consider liking and subscribing, and let's jump right into the video. So with the NFL draft just a few days away, there were some teams that I was just thinking about, and I was thinking about some teams that are in desperate need of having a good draft. Now, I've already made a video discussing which teams I think need to have a good draft, but those are mainly focusing on the teams that are going to be contenders next year, teams that are going to fight for a playoff spot. But I was also thinking about teams that needed to have a good draft just based off of the current situation that they're in, and the Seattle Seahawks is a team that came to my mind after reading through some of the NFL stories that I saw on Twitter just surfacing the internet. And as I was reading about the Seattle Seahawks and just looking at the way that this offseason has went for the Seahawks, I think it's starting to get to a point where the Seahawks are in trouble, and it's time to worry if you're a Seahawks fan, and for the organization to start worrying because of the situation and where they're at as a franchise. The Seahawks have not had a good offseason whatsoever. If we're looking at higher profile franchises in the NFL, teams that we look at on a consistent basis as teams that, have been good for at least the last 10 years, or teams that get talked about all the time, the Seattle Seahawks and the Dallas Cowboys are the two teams that I think personally have had some of the worst off seasons of any team in the NFL this year. Those two teams I think have had really bad off seasons and are in spots that they really need to improve their team, and they have so many holes that I don't know if just the NFL draft themselves is really going to be able to help the Seahawks. Yes, the draft is coming up, and they do have a chance at getting it better. They have 8 picks. They have the number 9 overall pick after trading Russell Wilson to the Denver Broncos. But if you look at the Seattle Seahawks and their history of draft picks, I don't know if I would really trust the Seattle Seahawks, Pete Carroll, to hit on any other draft picks, because if we're looking at some of the nice pieces that the Seattle Seahawks have drafted in recent years, I can only come up with 2, and one of them you could consider a bust just because of where he was drafted a few years ago. But if we're looking at the guy that the Seattle Seahawks hit on, and one of the only guys the Seahawks have hit on in the last few years, and that's DK Metcalf. He's been their best pick in the last 3 drafts that the Seahawks have had. But the problem is with the Seattle Seahawks, they're in a tough spot with DK Metcalf because he's been in a lot of trade rumors, and it looks like a lot of teams are willing to trade away some draft capital, trade away some players to pick up DK Metcalf to improve their team. And so the Seattle Seahawks, if they lose DK Metcalf, they're not in a really good spot heading into next season because of everybody they lost. I think for the Seahawks, if they want to at least still be a team that can get better, maybe not this year, but next year, they got to keep at least a couple key pieces. And if they lose DK Metcalf, they're going even further backwards than what they already are right now. But he's also a part of that group of 2019 star receivers that are looking to get paid with Deebo Samuel, AJ Brown, and Terry McLaurin. So at some point he's going to want to get paid, and I don't know if DK Metcalf, he's going to want to get paid, but I don't know if he's going to want to play for a bad team in Seattle anymore. So that's kind of the situation where the Seahawks are at with DK Metcalf. He's not a guy that you want to lose right now just based off of where you're at as a franchise. And the only other guy that I could think of that the Seattle Seahawks have drafted notably that anybody talks about is Rashad Penny. He hasn't produced big numbers. I mean, late last season, he really stepped up his game. It looked like he was producing bigger numbers. He was playing a lot better. But Rashad Penny, being drafted in the first round back in 2018, I don't think he's really lived up to the hype of being a first round trip, the moniker of being a first round pick. And so when it comes to the draft, the Seattle Seahawks, they're just not good at drafting players. And while they have draft capital, while they have ways to improve the team, their track record of not drafting well is going to come back to haunt them. And I think the Seattle Seahawks, when it comes to at least a draft wise, are in a pretty rough spot heading into this year's draft. But then you just look at the offseason as a whole, because it's not just the draft that you have to focus on. The Seattle Seahawks went back a million steps just based off the guys that they lost. They traded away Russell Wilson to the Denver Broncos, and that's obviously a massive loss for the Seattle Seahawks. Many could argue, and I could see the argument, that the Seahawks have only been relevant even the last few years because of Russell Wilson. They've had a really bad defense, their offensive line is bad, and that the Seattle Seahawks are just lucky that they've had a guy like Russell Wilson to just at least keep them from drowning, basically, because it feels like Russell Wilson has kept them afloat and has really been a bright spot on a team that has been pretty bad the last couple of years. I know they made the playoffs, I think it was in 2020, but I mean, it wasn't a really good playoff run, and the Seahawks last year just were really bad even when Russell Wilson was playing. But they traded away Russell Wilson, who's been a Pro Bowler 9 times in his 10 seasons. He's been to 2 Super Bowls, winning a Super Bowl with the Seattle Seahawks, and they've lost their franchise franchise guy, the guy that's been, again, the life force of this team ever since he got there, and especially the last few years. He's been the lone bright spot, it really feels like, in my opinion, for the Seattle Seahawks just in the last couple of years. And like I said, they got draft capital in return, but with their track record of drafting, I don't know if that's really a good thing for the Seattle Seahawks to have. And now they have Drew Lock as their quarterback, so I don't know if that's really a spot that you want to be in, because Drew Lock really isn't that franchise guy. It didn't work out in Denver for Drew Lock, and Pete Carroll says that they really don't want to be a part of a rebuild. But if you ask me, if you have Drew Lock as your quarterback, you are going to be a team that's in a spot that's rebuilding rather than a team that wants to win or using him as a bridge quarterback. You're kind of rebuilding at that point. If you're admitting Drew Lock's your quarterback, you're kind of a rebuilding team. And then if you look at this year's draft, the quarterbacks really aren't the guys that are going to be taking over this draft, the guys that aren't going to be talked about the most in this year's draft. So when it comes to that, the Seattle Seahawks at the quarterback position, I think, are in a lot of trouble. But then you also have to bring up the fact the way they handled Bobby Wagner's release. They released him and he didn't even know that he was going to be released. I think he found out through social media. The team didn't even contact him. So that's just a really bad look for the Seahawks. And again, they losing a life force for the Seattle Seahawks, that guy that was holding down that defense for his time in Seattle. And it's just sad that the Seahawks in one offseason got rid of both guys from the 2012 draft that were just the cornerstone of the entire franchise, and losing both of them in the same offseason is really bad for the Seahawks. It's kind of a disaster if you ask me. Those are the two guys that you can rely on both on the offense and the defense to be there on a weekly basis, be there on a consistent basis, and losing both of those guys isn't really putting the Seahawks in a good spot at all heading into the draft. And then you have Bobby Wagner, who's now with the Rams, and now he gets to play them twice a year, so now they're just going to have to feel the pain of playing him twice a year, losing to them probably twice this upcoming season. And it really stings for the Seattle Seahawks to lose both Russell Wilson and Bobby Wagner in the same offseason. Two guys, like I said, that have been the cornerstone of the franchise since they were drafted. So overall, the Seattle Seahawks have not had a good offseason. And like I said, I think the Seattle Seahawks are in kind of a big hole, and I think they are in trouble because you look at their history of drafting, it hasn't been good. You lose Russell Wilson, you're not in a good spot. You lose Bobby Wagner, a guy that's been an amazing defensive player since he came into the league back in 2012. You're just all over the place. The Seattle Seahawks have massive holes that they have to fill, and I don't think they've done a single thing this offseason to try to get better, because I don't think this draft is going to be enough to help the Seahawks get better. They're in the toughest division in the NFC, and you could still argue that the NFC West is still one of the toughest divisions in all of football, maybe the toughest. There's an argument for that still. So the Seattle Seahawks in a division that's going to be really tough, and just a draft that lacks a quarterback, which they really need desperately, I think the Seattle Seahawks are in trouble. But at the end of the day, it's the NFL. Who knows what's going to happen? The Seattle Seahawks could surprise us all, and they might be a really good team next year. And if they are, I'm all here for it, and I will happily be wrong about this entire video. But give me your thoughts down below of what you think of the Seattle Seahawks. Do you think they're in trouble, or do you think they're in a good spot heading into the draft? And do you think they can improve and get better? But give me your thoughts down below, and I'll see you in the next one.